Yes. I mean, you're asking me a provocative question. I'm giving you a provocatively simple answer. Yes. I have seen too much of the world and too much of the Arab world and too much of jihadism to be fooled by bullshit.
Welcome back to SoulCube Analytics, where we dive into pressing issues shaping our world today. I'm your host, Thomas Karat, and in this episode I talk with Dan Perry, the former head of Associated Press for Europe, Middle East and Africa. Dan is not only a seasoned media and communication expert with extensive experience in global affairs, but he is the publisher of the Substack newsletter Ask Questions Later. For those who don't want to fall victim to their own confirmation bias, I highly recommend reading it. But before we begin, a note of caution. Today's conversation with Dan might challenge some deeply held beliefs, perhaps on both sides. As former AP head for EMEA, Dan is a veteran journalist, someone who knows the Middle East inside out, and while he's a supporter of Israel, he's never been shy about his criticisms of the current government, especially under Netanyahu's leadership. Now let's be clear, Dan and I don't agree on everything. In fact, there are some serious divides between us. But that's exactly why this conversation matters. In an era where it's easier than ever to retreat into our own echo chambers, we can't forget the importance of hearing opposing views. Understanding doesn't mean agreeing, but it does mean listening. Remember, I'm approaching my interviews through the lens of a behavior analyst. I'm interested in what people think and the rationale they use to justify their own beliefs. So over the next hour or so we will explore those tensions, from Israel's controversial use of targeted assassinations to the role of the international media. We'll also confront some of the bigger questions. Who is the real instigator of the tensions in the Middle East? And what role does indoctrination on both sides play in the drama that is unfolding in front of our eyes in Gaza? This conversation isn't just about Israel and its critics. It's about the complex realities we face when ideals clash with pragmatism. So no, Dan and I didn't walk away from this conversation agreeing on everything. But maybe that's the point, because conversations like this one are a reminder that if we are going to solve the toughest issues of our time, we first have to be willing to sit down and listen, truly listen, even if it's uncomfortable. But before we do, a quick call to action. Some of the best interviews on this channel are shadow banned, which means YouTube is not presenting them to you, the viewer. The latest example is my interview with James Bamford, where we discussed the truly amazing story that underlies Benjamin Netanyahu's corruption scandal. Did you know that a Hollywood billionaire not only stole nuclear secrets from America, but then sold them to Israel? And that Netanyahu helped him to stay out of troubles to this very day? And then Netanyahu turned around and started to ask for favors, hence the bribery charges in Israel against him. Other examples are the interviews with the so-called Hamas lawyer Stanley Cohen, or the interview with the former chief of staff of Colin Powell, who told me that the white powder in the test tube that Colin Powell showed the world when he testified at the UN just before the war on Iraq was actually salt. So if you're interested in content that apparently you're not supposed to see, content that goes against the mainstream narrative, have a look at some of the previous interviews that we have recorded for your pleasure. And of course, it really helps to spread the news if you like and subscribe to this channel. Dan Perry, thank you so much for joining. We had a little hiccup, my bad, for the time. Thank you for joining nevertheless. I don't know where to start. I sent you my list. Yeah. So you were the AP Chief of Staff, extensive experience. You are on Substack. You wrote 2 books. If I see this correctly, most, if not all of your career was in journalism, but also specialized on the Middle East. So I have a number of key items here on my list. You covered the Arab Spring from 2010, 2011, the Gaza War 2014, Israel-Palestine conflict 2019-20, The Brexit. That's an outlier for somehow. Yeah.
No, I didn't cover Brexit. By the way, the correct way I think to introduce me is that I was the regional head of Associated Press in Europe, Middle East, and Africa.
Okay. Perfect. Perfect. Okay. So I turned the tables. Where do you want to start?
I think you got to ask the questions, man. Otherwise, you'll start having me ask you questions about Amsterdam and Herz-Wilders and Nation.
That's actually a good one, Geert Wilders. So we have now a right-wing government. No, Geert Wilders, a right-wing representative, yeah, was elected. I think I don't. What is it now? 4 or 5 months ago. I'm not even sure. Yes, we do have a government now, but they try as much as possible to keep the right wings out. Now, the link to Israel is, of course, that Israel also has a right-wing government. I think the most right-wing government in its history, with Netanyahu leading it, which could lead us into a discussion: how free is Netanyahu actually in his actions, reactions in the war in Gaza, based on the fact that he has such a right-wing government, which probably would crumble the government if he wouldn't do what they want him to do.
Well, I mean, as in any coalition government, he's limited. He can't too badly upset any one member of that government. What gives them strength is the fact that nothing particularly good awaits them in a different government. So let's suppose the ultra-Orthodox religious parties don't get everything they want from him, and he promised them pretty much everything they want, and it's outrageous things, but they're not happy with the pace of implementation. If they bring down a government and the result is a liberal, centrist, leftist government, they'll get nothing. Uh, so um, so the threats may not be real. The accepted narrative, and it may be true, is that the threats from the extreme right party, which has 14 out of the 64 seats in the 120 seat Knesset, so the 14 could bring them down. They have very extremist demands, and they would be very unhappy if the war in Gaza ended now with Hamas still in power. And uh, people believe that that's one reason why Netanyahu is not doing the deal to end the war and bring back the hostages. Um, Other people believe that uh, that they're not so stupid as to bring down this government that's very good for them. And this is just sort of a narrative that the government is selling the people and the world in order to maintain the illusion of Netanyahu being somehow not extremist himself. Um, but beyond all that, it must be said that the idea of doing what seems to me to be the only deal on the table, which is to end the war and pull out of Gaza in exchange for a return of the hostages, plus a lot of the release of many, many prisoners, Palestinian prisoners held in Israeli prison, many of whom are really terrible terrorists and convicted murderers. That is a very big price for Israel to pay. And if after all this disaster, they end up with Hamas still in power in Gaza and able once again to regroup and to attack them again, as they promised they will, that's something not even moderate Israelis really want. Now, there's yet another aspect, which is even though the idea that after October 7th, Hamas should be crushed and that no country in the world would have tolerated any such thing is pretty much a consensus idea in Israel. It just is. Um, there's increasing sense that the war has not been conducted well and that it may be being prolonged pointlessly and it may be time to cut your losses, regroup, get the hostages and try again, even though it would be a terrible failure. And it would give not just Hamas but global jihadi groups a victory narrative. They can say, "Oh, we defeated the Zionists." Of course, because they are satanic, demonic, and diabolical, they don't care that the result was a complete catastrophe for their own people. It'll be seen as a victory for jihadism. And to the extent that this strengthens jihadi groups all over the world and makes Iran more brazen and encourages the Houthis and Hezbollah and who knows what all, that's not particularly good for the Middle East or the world. So a lot is at stake here. And it's more complex than just saying, well, Netanyahu is being intransigent, which he is. Which he is. But it's a far more complex picture. So even though, for example, I am a frequent critic of Netanyahu, on all my TV appearances, and on my Substack publication, Ask Questions Later, and in my columns in Newsweek and forward, you'll find me criticizing Netanyahu all the time. There is also the subtext that even though Israel has one of the worst governments in the democratic world, perhaps in the history of the democratic world, uh, it's still the less objectionable sign. In other words, the true instigator of this disastrous war was Hamas. And Hamas was not doing this for Palestinian rights, but rather for a mutation of the idea of anybody's rights, which is attached to global jihadism. Their vision of the future is not something any person who supports any version of universal humanist values or liberal democracy should conceive of supporting. So when I see these imbeciles in the West, in the far left, basically, but not only, in confused progressive circles and also in Muslim circles, but who aren't really Hamasniks as such, uh, flirting with supporting Hamas in this war, I'm rather horrified. And it only strengthens the Israeli right.
A couple of things to say. One last thing for Netanyahu. Yeah? I just literally minutes ago, I watched a video with you and a panel where you were discussing the demonstrations within Israel being between 500,000 and 750,000 people strong. Yeah, and then I heard Gideon Levy saying that doesn't matter for Netanyahu because those are the people who anyway don't vote for him. Yeah, so these demonstrations in Israel will they have, as far as you can tell, any effects on what Netanyahu and his right-wing government will do?
No, not really. Now, what they represent, which is great opposition, conceivably could. But the demonstrations themselves, it doesn't matter if it's 2 million people. Because the only thing that matters is 64 people. The 64 lemmings and quislings in his coalition, well, 63 plus himself, that support this government, which I believe is terrible for Israel. Again, not as bad as Hamas by a million miles, but terrible for Israel and just bad in general. That's all that matters, 64, not 500,000 and not a million. Now, and by the way, in the democratic world, demonstrations rarely really matter. I mean, you could say 68 in France, maybe a little bit, but really, I mean, no, not really. What matters is public opinion. Now, is it true what you just said that it's just the regular people that hate him anyway? Perhaps now more vehement, perhaps now more inclined to go out into the streets. Not really, no. No, because it's mostly them, sure. But in a democracy where the vote is so close, even a small shift matters. And by the way, the election of 2022 was a complete tie. The 64 seat majority out of 120 is a distortion of the actual vote because 6% of the vote was thrown away and all of it was center left vote because parties split and didn't make the threshold. So in reality, look at the actual votes, it's a tie. A small shift could easily bring him down, and all the polls show that the debacle, the complete breakdown of October 7th, and a strategic cataclysm that is implied by it, because Netanyahu propped up Hamas. Um, that already made a shift of about 10%. So so here's the thing: the demonstrations are mostly the 50% that hate him anyway, but it's also maybe another 10% that have shifted, or that are just very, very angry over the failure of October 7th and the conduct of the war. So the real numbers that matter is what you see in the polls. The polls show, and again, it's not one poll. It look at all the polls show, uh, and they're historically rather accurate in Israel. That if there was an election held today, the opposition to Netanyahu would get like 71 to 75 seats. In other words, about 15 seats, 10 to 15, have shifted. About 50% of public opinion has shifted against him. Now, because Netanyahu is a brilliant political tactician and a great rhetorical talent, he can work with that. He can work with the fact that their support is down from 50% to 40% because he figures he can fool enough foolish people to get it back. And he can create circumstances to get it back. And so there isn't yet panic in his coalition. There is unhappiness, but not panic. Now, if the polls moved another 10%, and it started to look like a total collapse, then that would matter. That would matter. Because his coalition partners would start panicking. Likud, his own party, would start panicking. They'd realize they're going to get truly crushed, and there's no hope of winning these people back. And then they might bring down a government from within or try to replace him from within. So my point is, it's bad for him. The badness of it is represented in the big demonstrations, but it really isn't bad enough to create the level of panic that would be required for all of it, the demonstrations, the polls, the public sentiment, the vehemence, the op-eds, the podcasts, to actually have an effect. In other words, the Rubicon has not been crossed.
You just said rightly that Netanyahu supported Hamas, and we know that he funded Hamas via Qatar. And apologies, so I watched all afternoon interviews that I could find where you were speaking, and I thought I heard you talk about Fatah and the two-state solution. Yeah, so Fatah supports, also the PA in the West Bank supports a two-state solution, and the Fatah should be strengthened. Yeah, but that's exactly the opposite of what Netanyahu wants, because he funded Hamas to weaken Fatah because they would be a partner in the two-state solution, which is clearly not what Netanyahu wants.
Well, Thomas, let me just say these things, the mess that has been created in the Holy Land is so big that no podcast viewer who's not insane is ever going to be able to understand it. I think only insane people can understand it. When we say Hamas was funded by Netanyahu, it's not exactly that, because the entire world was screaming that money should be sent into Gaza for healthcare, for education, for infrastructure, you know, because it is under a blockade by Israel and Egypt. And rightly so, because if they could just have free import of goods, they'd build more rockets. So there was pressure on Israel to allow money to go in. And within Israel, there was pressure on Netanyahu to not let money go in order to make Hamas unpopular. So finally, the Palestinians bring them down, because everyone suspected one day you'd have an October 7th. Netanyahu allowed this. So it wasn't money going from Qatar to Hamas because Netanyahu asked. It was Netanyahu allowing money from Qatar to go to Gaza, even though Hamas is in power. Now, what they of course did is, instead of using the money for healthcare, normal education, and normal infrastructure, they used it to build rockets and an incredible network of tunnels and an education that indoctrinates the young people to kill Jews and attack Israel. I mean, they have like elementary school programs, teach the kids to like do jihad and attack Jews, and they have mock-ups of kibbutzim and they attack them. And little kids are told this is their purpose in life, to die in such a quest. So the money was misused. Okay? Now, take a step further back. Yeah, Netanyahu, in his always overly complex calibration of everything, had a notion that there's a good part to having genocidal, nihilistic jihadis in charge of Gaza. Because as long as half the Palestinian territories are obviously maniacal, then this weakens the PA and weakens the calls on him to give them a state, because the PA doesn't control half its territory, and that half is run by madmen, and look, they're all just crazy. So somehow this diminished the pressure on Netanyahu to agree to a two-state solution. If Hamas was gone and the PA, Fatah, was in charge of Gaza and the West Bank, and maybe you had a better, less corrupt PA that was clearly presenting a nice liberal democratic face to the world, the pressure on Israel to allow to make serious headway towards a two-state solution would be enormous. So Netanyahu's kind of not wrong that Hamas's presence in Gaza indeed weakened that pressure, but it brought about this disaster. And you got to take another step back and say, well, is a two-state solution good or bad for Israel? And or or for the region and for the world, but start with Israel. Should they be trying to prevent it? And I say no. For this, you know what? Out of absolute demographic self-interest. Because Israel, plus West Bank, plus Gaza, has a slight Arab majority already. So I agree that leaving the West Bank especially is difficult from a tactical topographic point of view. If you look at the map, that's a big strategic risk. And it would have to be demilitarized, and a lot of things have to happen for this to not be a danger to Israel, including some mechanism where Hamas never takes it over. But there's no good options for Israel. There's only a need to identify the least bad option, right? It's like if I told you, Thomas, do you want a broken leg or do you want pancreatic cancer? And you have 1 second to decide. If you're smart enough, you're going to decide within a tenth of a second, give me my broken leg. But most people may not be that smart, which is one of the problems of democracy.
You said a couple of things to unpack then. Leaving the West Bank. So I interviewed a couple of subsequent experts. Yeah. Leaving the West Bank in this stage, some argue would lead to civil war within Israel, especially with the right-wing government. Yeah. So any government which would try now to, I mean, I'm talking about the West Bank. Yeah. Not even Gaza. Gaza is already an issue. Yeah, where Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, openly propagated and discussed beachfront property in Gaza. Right. So we see already where the thought process on the potentially future president goes to. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then you said kids indoctrinated, in Gaza, yeah. I interviewed Miko Pelet's sister, Professor Nurit Pelet, yeah. She had research done in regards to racism in Israeli school books, yeah. So the situation is not much different, yeah, on any side. I mean, we could go to Holland probably or to America, right?
No, it's not true. I mean, I have to say it's not true. I've seen all the textbooks. I have lived in like 5 countries. I've seen many countries' textbooks. I know Holland reasonably well. No, these jihadi textbooks and the entire jihadi indoctrination system is brainwashing by crazy people to make everyone crazy. And it's a false equivalence. Um, as for, sure, I mean, you can object to a lot of things, and I do. And many things about the Israeli educational system are not to my liking, and I've never hidden that. But it's not the same. It is indeed like a broken leg versus pancreatic cancer.
Indoctrination, manipulation, yeah, it's in any society to different degrees. I completely agree, and I'm not saying that in Holland you have Islamic indoctrination in general schools. That's not what I'm saying. Yeah.
Oh yeah,
But
I'm just saying there's a point where a difference of degree becomes a difference of principle. Yeah. If you steal a stamp worth 50 euro cents, that's different from robbing $1 billion from a bank, right? Both are theft, but the difference of degree is a difference of everything. That's what we're talking about. Hamas is indefensible. There is no set of words that can defend Hamas. And if you hate what Israel did in Zionism, it still doesn't defend Hamas. If you want Israel to disappear, it still doesn't defend Hamas. Hamas is indefensible, this whole jihadi thing. That's the problem. That's why Netanyahu still gets votes. Because when it looks like the other side might have confusion on this point, then the people just abandon. Because people who are close to it understand. And by the way, the first people understand is Muslims in this region who have not been indoctrinated. I mean, Hamas is the biggest enemy of the Palestinians. Its number 2 enemy, I think, is Israel, but number 1, Israelis hate Hamas, but an intelligent Palestinian who's not a jihadi should hate Hamas more. Anyway, as for the civil war in Israel, if they tried to leave the West Bank, sure, it would be extremely politically volatile. And that's part of the bad option. That is the least bad option. That's part of the broken leg. They're going to have, probably not civil war, but a great amount of unpleasantness. Huge. But if they don't do that, they're going to lose the country. Because eventually, with these boneheads filling the West Bank with settlers, it's going to become too many settlers and an impossibility to separate. And then the world will insist on a one-state solution.
Ben Gurion already in his letters to his son wrote that he will or would or has accepted partition only as a means to an end, right? So from the very beginning, the Zionist project was not interested in a two-state solution. Yeah?
I don't know that. I mean, he accepted he accepted partition, which the revisionists, Menachem Begin and others in the 1940s didn't. Yeah, as a means to an end, to having a Jewish state. He certainly wrote and said that he'd rather have the entire territory of British Mandatory Palestine, but with Ben Gurion, it wasn't a trick. There was no plan to. It was just he said, "We accept this. We want all of it, but we can't have it, so we accept it as a means to a solution, which is a viable Jewish majority state." You can you can fault Ben Gurion for something else, for encouraging the departure of about 600,000 Palestinian Arabs from the part Israel kept. Now, honestly, you can say that's bad, sure, that this happened, but it created a demographically viable Israel. These people should have been compensated for sure. But I think when you look at that situation, you have to also consider other things, like the fact that at the same time, 1 million Jews were kicked out of the Arab countries, mostly kicked out, um, with no compensation. No one speaks of compensation. Israel welcomed them, whereas the Palestinians were not welcomed in countries 10 kilometers away. Do you know that in Lebanon today, the great great grandson of a Palestinian refugee from 1948 in the Galilee doesn't have rights to citizenship, healthcare, or the same education as Lebanese citizens? They're not citizens. This is lunacy because they are the same Sunni Arabs of the Levant. There is no actual difference except that the creation of Israel created a Palestinian national mindset, but that did not exist before 48. Just didn't. Um, and at the same time, during that exact same period, about 15 million Hindus and Muslims in the Asian subcontinent moved around in similar ways to create a viable Pakistan and a viable India. And it's all unfortunate on an individual level, but there were so many population movements that were compelled, including so many Germans, in Europe and Middle East after World War II, that if that's Ben Gurion's biggest sin, then I think history can accommodate it.
I didn't say it was his biggest sin. It was just an observation. But just to verify, did you say you can fault Ben Gurion that he discouraged 650,000 Arabs to leave, or to encouraged?
No, no, no. Oh no, they were encouraged. I mean, Israel, many of them. Uh, Golda Meir used to claim that the new Israelis, they were begging the Arabs to stay. Well, maybe here and there that happened, but the bigger picture is that if they hadn't fled, the 600,000 in Israel already today, even Israel itself would not be a viable Jewish state. Uh, some of them, I think the what history has proven is that whereas maybe half, close to half, fled of their own volition, but under circumstances that encouraged it anyway. Possibly half or more were actually expelled by the Israeli troops.
Benny Morris told me Ben
Of
Gurion's
course, yeah.
biggest.
Yeah.
I interviewed him, yeah, and he told me Ben Gurion's biggest fault in his perspective is that he hasn't driven out all Arabs at that time.
Uh, Look, maybe some people think this. The Arabs that stayed at the time are now the 2 million Arab citizens of Israel. That's 20%. I I don't think, no, I don't think that's a majority view in Israel. The Arabs in Israel are, by and large, a positive player in this very messy situation.
I heard that more and more Israelis view the Arabs within Israel as a so-called fifth column.
Yeah, well, I mean, they're potentially history's most classic example of a potential fifth column. I mean, show me another country where you have a minority, that's a potential fifth column, that is the same ethnicity as the ethnicity of all of the surrounding countries, all of which have been at war with you at one time or other, or still are. If you can show me one other such example in history, I'd be surprised. Maybe depending on how you define the terms, maybe you'll come up with something vaguely similar. But this is extreme, and so especially because they are so classically a potential fifth column, the fact that they've been, by and large, loyal citizens, and many of them are truly assimilated, and they sound the same as any Jewish Israeli. Um, And by the way, there's a return because they have rights. I mean, the talk of the Israeli Arabs as complete and total second-class citizens is partly true in the same way that you could say of American blacks. But in fact, if you look at their successes and the positions many of them have held, you should be very careful to not conflate them with the unacceptable situation of the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. So this is a complex thing where there's some positivity there as well. They're right now in the West Bank and Gaza with Israel's treatment of the Palestinians and their treatment of themselves. There is not a molecule of positivity as far as I can see.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. One last thing that I would like to come back to before we go forward. You said the instigator was clearly Hamas. Yeah. How would you argue to those? I mean, I live in the Netherlands here, and Netherlands was occupied by the Germans, right? Now, the Gaza Strip and the West Bank is so occupied by Israel. Yeah? So, would there not be any other organization, no matter how you call it, after what, 75, it depends when you start to count, yeah? But after decades of extremely brutal occupation, would there not be any other organization, however it's ever called, to try to free its people?
No,
Can we really start at October 7 and say Hamas was the instigator of what's happening right now? That's
yes,
the root cause. Is that not
yes,
going much further back?
yes, yes. I mean, you're asking me a provocative question. I'm giving you a provocatively simple answer. Yes. I have seen too much of the world and too much of the Arab world and too much of jihadism to be fooled by bullshit. Okay? You know what an extremely brutal occupation is? The Nazi occupation of Ukraine and Poland. That was extremely brutal. Uh, Israel's occupation of West Bank is not brutal, but it's by and large a response to a security threat that is real. And as for Israel's occupation of Gaza, I just don't buy it. Israel blockaded Gaza, yes. I think words are important, but Israel did not occupy Gaza. And Israel blockaded Gaza, not with troops and not with settlers, not with anything else, not since 2005. And the only reason Israel blockaded Gaza is because these criminals from Hamas threw out the PA in 2007, throwing them from the rooftops and forcing them to flee, took over the territory, made it illegal to have a beer, and immediately began to try to attack Israel, forcing Israel and Egypt to blockade them. Now, they always had the choice of saying, we're going to be okay with a peace process, and we're going to stop firing rockets at you. And then Israel would not have blockaded them anymore. And the blockade is the only thing justifying the distortion of language used by people who say, well, Gaza's occupied. No, it's not occupied. Gaza's blockaded because they're run by aggressive criminals. Now, if you want to talk about the issue of how, Hamas, October 7th was not the beginning of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and Israel does abuses in the West Bank, no argument, and Israel harms Palestinians' ability to achieve self-determination with these awful, stupid settlements in the West Bank. All that is true. All that is true. But Hamas does not stand for liberating the West Bank and Gaza. Hamas stands for obliterating Israel and for establishing a Muslim caliphate over the entirety of the Holy Land, the West Bank, Israel, and Gaza, which will not be democracy, which will have no room in it for any liberal values, which will make a mockery of these Western humanistic ideas about self-determination, which will oppress its own people worse than Iran oppresses its own people. And basically, what Hamas has done since for 35 years is whenever it looked like Israel and the rational Palestinians were moving towards a two-state solution, it launched terrorist blitzkriegs meant to move the Israeli public to the right and therefore kill that idea and that process. And very tragically, they succeeded. Netanyahu first came to power in 1996 by a whisker, because in the days leading up to the election, every week buses would blow up and 20, 30 Israelis would be killed. And the Labor Party, then in power, of Shimon Peres, seemed unable to do anything about it, so people stopped believing in peace. So Hamas sabotaged the two-state solution that Peres, without a shadow of a doubt, would have tried to implement in good faith. So no, I'm not going to be fooled. They are the enemy of the two-state solution. If God forbid their like ever take over one state, that state will be a state in which Jews will have no place, in which Palestinian modern people will have no place, and which will be a menace to the world, the same way Iran is, and the parts of Lebanon and Yemen controlled by Hezbollah and the Houthis are respectable.
Because you brought up Iran, shifting the topic for a moment. Yeah. So Israel attacked Iran's embassy in Syria. Israel assassinated one of the chief negotiators, yeah, in Iran on the night, also after the night or in the evening of the inauguration of Iran's new president. Yeah. So, I mean, that does look very much like that Israel is really trying to provoke the US into a war with Iran, which Netanyahu tried since I don't know how many decades. Yeah. So who is the real? And again, I make it a bit provocative, and you are an experienced journalist. You can easily handle that. Yeah. So who is the real instigator here? If we look at these kind of things, and that's not a new thing. I just finished reading the book Arise and Kill Early, yeah, which is a 700-page book outlining targeted assassinations from Israel. Yeah, if you read such a book, yeah, you can only wonder. I mean, this is all behind the scenes, which hardly ever come to light. Yeah, all these needle stings. Yeah, you can call them provocations or whatever. Yeah, so it's a very two-sided battle that goes on out of sight of the public opinion, and I know for sure that you, as an experienced journalist, you know all that. Yeah, so
What's the
I
question?
do not. Yeah, where I want to go with this is in light of what I said at the very beginning. So who is the real instigator here?
Uh,
The
the
targeting of any kind of process in this area. Yeah,
the current war
yeah.
begun.
The current war is just a symptom of a much larger cause
I disagree.
underlying. Yeah,
I just disagree. The current war was launched by Hamas. End of story. That so many people have been killed in Gaza is desired by Hamas. If you know anything about them from up close, there can be no doubt about this. That is why they seem in no way shocked. I mean, think about Dutch people. If you started a war with Belgium because the Walloon terrorist group did it October 7th, and the result was so many people killed in Holland, would you not maybe want to end the war? Give back the hostages, say, okay, we're going to regroup. Hamas seems to have no problem with what happened, which is why probably today, if there was a vote in Gaza, they would be crushed and torn limb from limb, despite how many people have been brainwashed. It's not 100%, and yeah. So Hamas is the instigator of this war. There is an unresolved conflict between Israel and the Palestinian people, where if you want to resolve it in any way, the Palestinian people have to be represented by rational nationalist groups and not jihadi religious groups. As for individual actions and assassinations, it's never a good look for journalists to justify assassinations. So I'm not going to go there. But the fact is, the Second Intifada, one of the things that brought it to an end, and it was not a helpful thing, the Second Intifada, uh, was Israel's assassinations of the Hamas leadership. And honestly, from an Israeli perspective, I can tell you the killing of the Hamas leaders, whether it's Rantisi or Sheikh Yassin 20 years ago, or Haniyeh today, and I'm sure they're all hoping for Sinwar very, very soon, a little bit analogous, and forgive the analogy, a little bit analogous to assassinating Hitler. Assassinations are bad, but would you really shed a tear? Would the neighbors of Anne Frank have shed a tear for the inappropriate process of assassinating Hitler? I think not. Anything that puts an end to Hamas probably is good for the world.
but will it? But will it? That's exactly the point. These assassinations, they only drive more people into
Well,
the arms of Hamas.
they ended the Second Intifada, and I do think that if they manage to kill Sinwar, that will probably end the current war. It probably would. So you can view it as provocations, and the thing that really causes me to not completely defend it, but just explain how it fits into the bigger picture, is that I don't trust the current government. The current government of Israel is very different from Israel. Now, it was elected, so I can't say it's as different from Israel as Hamas is different from the Palestinians. Very foolish people in Israel elected this government, sort of. Like I say, the vote was a tie. But it's a very particular government that has currently minority support and is constantly under suspicion of doing what it can to prolong the war. Because this criminal defendant, Netanyahu, who is on trial for corruption, uses the war to machinate delays in his trial. And because the failure of October 7th was so absolutely indefensible on an intelligence, tactical, strategic, conceptual level, uh,
And the reaction, I mean, the reaction to October 7th, it took up to 48 hours on some places. They were
well,
like,
that's a tactical. I mean, on the ground, it was a complete failure, and it attaches to Netanyahu, who had been warned by the security establishment that the ridiculous judicial overhaul he was attempting in Israel was creating such a division in Israel that it invited attack. So anyway, October 7th is an argument he can't win. He may be a brilliant rhetorician, but he can't win that argument. With the war, he has introduced a paradigm. And the paradigm he's introduced is, well, we can have the discussion about October 7th, which is political, as long as we're all fighting together. All right? Now, that obviously creates an incentive for a very prolonged war. And the only person in Israel who has an incentive to do that is Netanyahu. The country has every incentive to make it, short, fast, strong, decisive, and elegant. And Netanyahu, obviously, theoretically, has an incentive for the very opposite. Now, this is terribly cynical. I mean, it's so cynical that it normally would not apply to a politician. Because I'm not a person who thinks all politicians will do that calculation. I'm not even sure Netanyahu has done that calculation, but I don't rule it out. I don't like if you came to power in the Netherlands, just from the hour we've been speaking, I would rule it out. I'd say Thomas would not do this. With Netanyahu, who I've interviewed 5 times, I don't rule it out. So, because they're so completely under suspicion of skullduggeries and chicaneries and machinations, this creates a big cloud over everything they do, a cloud of suspicion and bad karma. And they should do politics before the war ends, and they should get rid of this government. And they need a leadership who has fundamental credibility, which these guys don't. On top of fundamental competence, which these guys don't.
yeah. In regards to Netanyahu's corruption scandals, because there's 3. There's one that really spiked my interest, so to speak. Are you aware of his connection with Aaron Milchan?
Sure.
Yeah. So in the background, are you aware? I mean, this whole nuclear smuggling story that Aaron Milchan actually headed, which he himself admitted on a television program in Israel, which was then somehow transmitted to America, as a result of which he lost his 10 years visa, where he then reached out to Netanyahu, who reached out to John Kerry 3 times to get this visa reinstated. And then Netanyahu turned around and started to ask for favors. Yeah, that's in a nutshell, that's the story. Yeah? But the point is that Netanyahu himself, according to FBI documents obtained through the Freedom of Information Act, Netanyahu himself worked and was paid for by Aaron Milchan. He worked for one of his companies directly related to nuclear smuggling, stealing nuclear secrets, nuclear smuggling, and selling them to Israel. Yeah?
When did he work for this company?
I can send you all the documents. All the
I don't. Everything's so far so good, but this business of Netanyahu working for a Milchan company.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, when he was a politician, because he's been in public service since like.
No, he was chief of staff in the embassy in Washington, Israeli embassy in Washington at that time.
So look, if true, that sounds inappropriate, but I can't really comment on this. I don't know if Netanyahu worked for a Milchan company or was involved.
But this is not where I want to go to. Yeah, the actual interesting thing is here that consecutive U.S. governments were aware of that fact and covered it up. By doing so, they actually violated their own nuclear non-proliferation contract or act, or however you call it. Yeah, and that in turn would have to mean that the U.S. has to stop funding Israel. Yeah, so that's the underlying story here. Yeah, I interviewed James Bamford. He's an American investigative journalist who brought this to my attention. Incredible. Yeah, but nobody's picking this up. I found only 3 or 4 journalists on the internet. You can try. I can send you some information who picked this up, and I do not understand why. Because that goes to the very core of U.S.-Israel relations. Yeah.
Well, but
So I don't.
there's a lot of tripwires in what you said. A lot of things, very many things in the story that if it was true, model applies. So if everything is true, yeah, that's kind of bad. And would that mean they have to cut off funding to Israel because he's a prime minister? I don't even know if that's the case, but certainly looks bad. Except the I'm not aware of the a smoking gun in your story, which is that Bibi personally worked for Milchin while this was happening. It's true that Milchin admitted that he was some version of an agent for Mossad, and it's
He
certainly
compared himself to James Bond. I have the
well,
clip. Yeah.
he's a very strange character. So it's possible that not everything that he says is necessarily fully accurate and precise. I just don't know. But what is clear is that he was, according to the indictment, is that he was providing gifts to Netanyahu's family like nobody's business.
Against his will, he was detesting the fact that he was asked or more or less forced by Netanyahu for this kind of presence for himself and
I
his
was
wife.
forced, but I
Yeah.
think in the testimony, his assistant made clear that their story is that he was asked, "Send me this."
He was asked by Netanyahu, but he had no choice. Yeah. So he detested.
I
So Milchan detested the fact that he had to give something to.
But it kind of sounds like, according to the narrative you just have woven, it kind of sounds like Milchin has leverage over Netanyahu and not the other way around.
I believe Milchan definitely has, yeah, and he said it himself. He was asked on in an interview if he's not afraid, if he's not afraid about Netanyahu or the Mossad or whatever, and he said literally no because there's many more bullets in his chamber. That's Milchan's words.
Hmm.
Yeah. Also
Well, it's
this is a very interesting story, and I do not understand why nobody else is picking this up. I just don't get it. Yeah.
uh, stories that have validity generally are picked up. Conspiracy theories about
This has
reasons
not,
why.
look, I'm referring to FBI documents obtained through the Freedom of Information Act, and I can send them to you.
Sure.
Anything I said is in those documents.
By all
Yeah?
means, send it.
Nothing about conspiracy.
No,
I had
no,
to
no, no.
disappoint you there.
When you say why is no one picking it up, many people will quickly jump from that to, well, there's a conspiracy why they're not picking it up. You know,
No.
I've generally found maybe my years in the Arab world which is given to conspiracy theories, uh, more than most, perhaps in my experience, have made me very skeptical of conspiracy theories. So I don't think there is one. I think if it hasn't picked up, it would be either because it can be debunked, or that there's not enough there, or that it's based too much on assumptions, or uh,
Are you saying the media is still free? The corporate media is still free today? Is that what you're saying?
oh,
Really free?
you're taking us
I
in a
can't resist to ask. I cannot
in a
resist.
conspiratorial direction.
Oh, you like the word conspiracy? Yeah.
I worked for the Associated Press for
Yeah.
28 years. All
Yeah.
right, that is one of the world's biggest news organizations. It's one of the most conventional because they try to upset no one. It's also one of the most professional with a high standards. And I was a director. I was the chief editor of AP in half the world, Europe, Middle East, and Africa. If there was a conspiracy, some things you say and other things you can't say, I would have known. I would have known. And not only that, if there's a conspiracy generally, everyone will know because some idiot will brag about it to some woman in a bar after 3 beers. Keeping a conspiracy secret is very difficult to ensure unless you have a very, very small circle that knows about the conspiracy. So look, is the media still free? Complicated question. For one thing, the media is a business, mostly. Not fully, but mostly. A business's main purpose is to not go out of business. Does this not affect how they go about their business? Are they slaves only to the truth? Well, I say AP is, yes. AP is. But is everyone? Might they not stay away from certain things that would cause them damage? Or it's not even about offending a corporate or political interest. that would cause them damage by offending their reading public. The reading public. Is the media free to cover all the important stories of the world that are expensive and dangerous to cover when many people don't give a damn about those stories? No, they may not be so free because if they did it, they'd go out of business.
So again, controversial question, yeah? We, the West, are 16% of the world population, right? So in this 16%, our media is more or less synchronized. You can find the same information left and right. Yeah. If you look outside of our media bubble, you hear a completely different story. So if our media is free, so how do we explain the big, large, fat discrepancy between the synchronized media in the West and the information that is outside?
Well, I don't know what information outside you mean. Some of the
Outside
information.
of outside of our media bubble. Go to India, for example, or outside of
Oh, I thought you
our.
meant like blogs in the U.S. and Western Europe.
No,
Uh,
I mean really newspaper, press, right? The view of the global South is so different from what we are getting here in the West.
oh,
And
sure.
when I say synchronized, I mean sometimes literally the same word in a different language. That's what I
No,
mean.
I'm
Yeah.
not so surprised. And again, I don't see some plan to do this. Humanity is very complex. There is a great diversity of culture. Culture determines mindsets and psychologies. Those things determine news sense, like what is news. Those things determine news consumption patterns from the readership and viewership side, what they want to see and hear. Uh, and so that that basic thing, what should be promulgated by the mainstream media, differs from culture to culture. I can say this: Western media, the serious Western media, by no means all of it, but the serious Western media, um, isn't trying, I don't think, to vehiculate some common top-down monolithic story by privileged controllers of the universe, only sixth of the global population, but rather has a certain mindset about what's important, has a certain narrative about its role in the world, and also, by the way, has professionalism. Like they have the serious media will try to do a dialectic where there's one side, there's another side, you listen to the other argument. That's not the case in much of the media in a developing world. It's also not the case in much of the media of the the yellow and scandal media in the Western world. But the serious media in the Western world, I would defend it. I really would. I can see that you're trying to compel me to like admit it has weaknesses, and it does. But I would defend it. I am basically a defender of the West. I am. Yes, they pillaged all these countries, and now they have stuff in museums in Britain. Sure, return the stuff. But if there's equal rights for women all over the world now, if there's universal suffrage, if there are notions of liberal democracy, I do believe they kind of come from the West. I think the self-flagellation is not right. And by the way, it's dangerous. I'll tell you why. All these progressive narratives about how the West is the oppressor and we didn't do anything right and we have to like receive all the world's oppressed into our countries, otherwise we're terrible and racist. These narratives are feeding the extreme right. That is what they're doing. Hertz Wilders in your country is a reaction to that. If Marine Le Pen comes to power in France, it's a reaction to that. I think it goes too far. So I don't want to contribute to it.
There are definitely dangers here. All because I'm only asking because I'm speaking with two different journalists from the BBC. They're both telling me independently from each other the same thing. If they would write what they want to write, they risk their careers. Yeah. Anyway, this is
No,
BBC.
no,
This is
no,
not
hold on.
AP.
Now, wait.
Okay.
Is the media free? Yes. Is every journalist, or by and large, I will stand by the serious media being reasonably free with the caveats I mentioned, that they got to take into account what their audience wants if they're a business. And sure, I mean, it's not unheard of that they try not to offend some big important advertisers or whatever. Fine, we understand all this. But still, they can do what they want. No one's going to like shut them down unless they call for rebellion or the assassination of the president or something. Are individual journalists free? No, none of us are free. unless you're a podcaster. Uh, no, if you work for an employer, you're not free. You can't just report on whatever story you want. Uh, that definition of freedom is almost irrelevant because at that point, nobody's free. And indeed, I mean, I could say any of us who are married are not free. We're not free. We're all going to live only so long. We don't have the freedom to live forever. So freedom is a little bit of an abstract concept. But yeah, the BBC, I fear, despite being in the area code of what I called the free media, I mean, it wouldn't be shocking to hear that they have groupthink there and that some things are out of bounds. I don't know for sure because I never worked there, but I've heard this as well. And certainly they seem to have an orthodoxy. Uh, but, you could also say that that's just journalistic standards. You could say it's political and terrible, and yeah, but a certain kind of not freedom could be seen as standards, a burden of proof, um, a fidelity to fairness and things of this nature.
Well, it's very specific in regards to Israel. Yeah? Anything critical to Israel is just not accepted. Anything. Yeah.
I
Anyway,
mean,
that
you
was
will
that
you
was
will actually find people in Israel thinking that the BBC is obsessed with criticizing the West Bank occupation in particular.
yeah. And by the way, I have to say some of the media in Israel is much more critical in Israel about Israel than outside. Yeah. Haaretz, right?
Well, I would distinguish about Israel from about the right-wing government. The media in Israel, most of it, is educated, secular people who understand the facts on the ground because it's journalists. I've just described basically journalists. Not all of them are, rocket scientists, but they're going to be intelligent and reasonably educated and knowledgeable. Now, people like that in Israel, 90% of them hate the government. As a fact.
90%.
90% of secular, of not religious,
Okay.
educated, intelligent, knowledgeable people who know how many Arabs live in West Bank and what therefore the demographic implications of forever controlling it are. Yeah, I think 90% may be conservative. That is why in Israel you have a really toxic division, as you have in other countries as well, between the elites and the salt of the earth.
Yeah. Do you foresee any kind of internal serious friction within Israel?
Yeah,
How
I do.
could it manifest itself?
Well, first
And
of
in
all,
which time frame?
the situation with the ultra Orthodox Jews is out of control. It cannot be sustained. They're having so many children that the state is paying for with subsidies that they're going to be a majority in 50 years. They're only 16% now, but they're having 7 children each, and it's systematic. They refuse to like teach their boys math, English, and science. Refuse to serve in the army. Half of them don't work. They want to study Torah all day and night until a very old age and be paid for it by the state, as opposed to paying a tuition for studies, is like I would have to do. So this is going to be a collapse. And by the way, they're part of the right wing bloc that creates conflict, and they refuse to serve in that conflict. Now, this is making everyone else increasingly crazy. So that's one problem. Secondly, the right wing in Israel, if it stays in power and doesn't do something differently, will bring about the ruination of Israel. Now, the elites I'm talking about, who understand this, are less and less inclined to accept it. So you're hearing talk about somehow it's not really realistic, but it kind of looks like it may be the less bad option of dividing Israel into two countries. Like a modern Western one that could be a member of the European Union. It would have the highest GDP in the European Union, which is the coastline, versus everyone else. And if you want to try to like settle the Palestinian lands and fight with the Palestinians forever and be religious maniacs, and off you go, and we want no part of it. Uh, but basically, if the right wing stays in power with the religious and they keep doing what they do, then I foresee Israel will not exist in 50 years' time. And again, I'm being conservative. It could be a lot before because these things can speed up. And the people who keep Israel being a very prosperous country that has a higher GDP per capita than Germany, France, and Britain right now still. I'm not sure about Holland, but maybe. Um, they're a fairly small percentage of the 10 million people. They're maybe a half a million. and they're mobile. And if they see there's no hope, then the vast majority of them will get up and go. And this will create a bigger and bigger Arab majority in the areas that Israel stupidly insists on occupying and settling. And down that path leads hopelessness, basically. Uh, so Israel's a really interesting case of a country that could be quite paradisical. I repeat, people don't know this. It's richer per capita than Germany. And there are many things in Israel that are very impressive and important for the world. Israel's, tech innovation sector does amazing things for the entire planet. That if you looked into that,
I did.
you may be a little surprised, or certainly your viewers would. No one knows this to the degree that it's true. It's almost a miracle. And yet, this country, because of a combination of terrible circumstances and challenges and enormous internal stupidity at the same time, is committing suicide. So it's quite exciting, but also very dispiriting to watch. It's to reuse a word I used before, it's bad karma.
Israel sells, I forgot the exact number now, to more than 120 countries high-tech AI related weapons. More than 120 countries. And as a consequence, that's the argument, yeah, these countries hesitate to vote against Israel whenever UN votes, etc., etc. Yeah. Again, I make it very black and white. Yeah. And
There seems to be an automatic majority against Israel at the UN General Assembly now.
well, it's always being vetoed anyway. Yeah. But
It's-
but but because you said, and Netanyahu said exactly the same thing in his interview with Lex Friedman. Yeah, Israel does so many good things for the whole planet. Yeah,
it isn't him, and it isn't his Israel, by the way. It's a
yeah,
different version of
yeah,
Israel.
yeah. But there is a documentary out there. It's called The Lab from Yotam Feldman. Yeah, and he dove into this arms selling of Israel. Yeah, people always say, let's stop selling arms to Israel to stop the war in Gaza. Yeah, that's what I'm hearing. No, the argument is the other way around. Countries should stop buying all those weaponized systems, however you call it, if there would be a real incentive for Israel
Look,
to stop the war.
Israel's a big arms exporter, and a lot of that.
Not only arms, but also the systems, more and more AI systems. Yeah,
Let's count it together because you're saying
yeah.
they're exporting
Okay,
bad
okay.
things.
Yeah.
So sure, there's
I
bad
didn't
things.
say.
But look, it's not the biggest and not even the top
Yeah.
five. So I mean,
What do you mean, not even in the top five? Israel is such a small country. You said it already, but the corresponding arms sales throughout the world is
sure.
massive.
I'm saying that's absolutely true. It's It's by proportion. It's probably number one by far. Uh, but this is not what's causing damage to the world. American arms exports probably cause a lot more, right? Also Chinese and definitely Iranian.
Russian.
If and Russian, but if you're saying, look, if you want to hurt Israel, stop buying its arms. Sure, that makes sense. Yes, I mean, if you want to hurt Israel, I would rather, but it would still survive. It would still be very prosperous.
No question. And nobody speaks about destroying Israel. Yeah, I'm speaking about
Oh, some people do.
incentivizing Israel to stop this slaughter of. I mean, the images. I mean, I'm a behavior analyst. I can tell you. I mean, the images that are coming out of Gaza. Yeah, and I'm not even talking about the images that Israeli soldiers themselves propagate, which might actually put them at risk for future prosecution. Right. But these images go into humans' subconscious. Yeah, these are images. Once you cannot unsee them. Yeah, so the war of images, the propaganda war, however Israel tries to twist it, it has lost due to its own doing. Yeah, I mean, the rape cases now. Channel 12 in Israel. I'm sure you saw it. Yeah, openly discussed to structurally apply rape as a means of torture. I mean, if you hear these kind of things, yeah, it's just staggering.
No, listen, no, I don't want to get into that report, but you're distorting it. There isn't a systematic rape
No, it
anywhere.
was discussed. It was discussed. Channel 12. I have the video.
Maybe some idiot discussed something,
Yeah.
but no. Look,
It was a panel. It was a
if you
panel.
truly
Yeah.
understood Israel, it is such a litigious country where this is why they wanted the judicial reform, where the liberal democracy enforced by the court system is sufficiently real, where any such notion is fantastical, truly. If there were rapes attached to anything involving the conflict, and I don't have proof here either, but you hear a lot about it. it would be on October 7th by Hamas, or by Hamas of hostages in captivity and so forth. Now, there have been cases for sure, but to view that as anything even close to anything systematic or policy related, I think is really false and a disservice to the truth. Uh, and look, it makes Israelis crazy to hear this, because the world has so many truly evil regimes where what I just said
Agree.
cannot be said. No, no, listen, the
Really.
list is so big, and you don't have to go far from Israel. Consider what probably is happening in the dungeons of the prisons in Syria and Lebanon, and even some of the nicer countries around Israel that have peace with Israel. To focus on Israel, that whatever wrong someone did is a million times less wrong, is absurd. Now, as for Gaza, and by the way, the Human Rights Commission of the UN, most of its activities against Israel, and on occasion, it's led by countries like North Korea, and it is preposterous. And this kind of uh, well, obsessive unfairness and picking on Israel helps the Israeli right, the same way that the progressive overreach helps the extreme right in Europe. It's not a good idea, and it isn't fair, and I will have no part of it. Uh, which is in no way to defend whatever happened or whatever moron was talking about on some panel. Um, I, as for the war and the images coming out of the war, I'm not there. I don't know what really happened. I don't know what was doctored. I have certainly there's a very strong assessment that terrible things have happened. Uh, but with all my skepticism for this government and my suspicion that it's trying to prolong the war for political reasons, it's not a simple situation at all. And anyone I talk to, I would say, all right, you know what, Thomas, you come to Israel, be the prime minister. What you gonna do? Are you gonna say, sure, let Hamas have the West Bank? Because then they're going to fire at your people rockets from 2 miles away. Are you sure you're going to do that? Are you going to say, well, they're just regular people who want peace and I'm going to believe them? Not unless you're an idiot, you won't. So it's very easy to criticize from far away. And many people, and you're right, what you said before, the Israeli media criticizes a lot from within a society. But their criticism is never ignorant. Their criticism is mainly, almost never, their criticism is of the Israeli right, which is frequently immoral, and absolutely incompetent, and has a strategic bug built into its system that has taken the country towards ruin. But many, many people in Israel are truly moral. Judaism at heart, not always, but at heart, is a moral undertaking that has a very strong ethical foundation. And I think total cynicism about Israeli society is very much misplaced. And justified criticism of the right-wing government should nonetheless always be in a context of what is an extremely difficult environment. I don't know of any country on earth that faces the challenges Israel does, certainly no democratic country. Um, it's kind of amazing to behold. So to criticize how they react to what is clearly an existential danger, not just danger, a clear and present danger, um, I think is justified always, but should be undertaken with a little bit of humility and perspective. I tell you what, Thomas, I gotta go. I told you.
I know, and I'm absolutely grateful for your time. Yeah,
Yep,
so thank you very much. It was my pleasure talking to you.
me too.
And I cannot promise that you do not hear from me again, at least for the links which I will send you once this interview is
Please
published.
do. I'd love to see it.
Okay. Again, then, thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure. See ya.
And this brings us to the end of this conversation, a conversation that, at times, was as complex and challenging as the issues we explored. Throughout our discussion, it became clear that the Middle East is not a place of easy answers or clear-cut solutions. It's a region shaped by history, power, and deeply entrenched conflicts. Dan Perry's insights remind us that even those who support Israel can hold deep concerns about its direction. And while he and I don't always see eye to eye, what's important is that we are able to engage, to disagree, and most crucially, listen. Because in the end, real dialogue doesn't happen when we only speak to those who think like us. If there's one takeaway from today's conversation, it's that the future of the Middle East will require more of these tough, uncomfortable exchanges. Not to find immediate agreement, but to understand perspectives that shape the actions of nations and individuals alike. So while Dan and I may not have solved any of the Middle East's long-standing issues, I believe we have shown that discourse, when done thoughtfully and with respect, can be a step towards something more productive. After all, only by truly listening can we begin to see the path forward. Let me know what you think of this discussion by leaving a comment. I'm reading every single one of them. Thank you for joining us, and until next time, stay engaged, stay informed, and most importantly, stay willing to listen to the other side.